words that simply say, you are an unceasing spiritual being with an eternal destiny in God's great universe.
Well, I'm so grateful to be here, grateful for this conversation. I was particularly drawn to this notion that we could talk about spiritual formation as an academic community. I don't know about you, but I often experience spiritual formation as kind of a silo experience in my context, where I'm the person, that is considered the expert in spiritual formation on our seminary faculty. And from talking with others over the years, I understand that's true in many places, where we become the spiritual formation person who is designated to speak to that particular area of focus within the curriculum and in the co-curricular area. But of course, what they don't know is that we're all lifelong apprentices, and there is no mastery of spiritual formation. Just like the master of divinity is a misnomer, so too is the notion that we are somehow experts in spiritual formation simply because we've studied and taught in this field. And so I'm looking forward to the conversation we're going to have together as fellow apprentices in this field. So our intent now is to spend a little bit of time in presentation and then actually to do some small group discussions, since we have agreed that we don't really have all the answers. In fact, we only maybe have a few. He has more than I do. But we're going to invite you all to discuss with one another. And I'm starting out by doing a kind of descriptive empirical task with you. I'm going to share a bit of a case study of one school, Truett Seminary, that is working toward formational outcomes and how we're working toward assessment in those. And then Dave is going to give us more of the interpretive moment, the description of how to understand this from a broader perspective, drawing upon the social sciences. So grateful for that. Also, just to begin, I want us to think of perhaps about a metaphor for understanding why assessment, why at this time and place in the development of spiritual formation in the Protestant church and the evangelical community are we now talking specifically and focusing on assessment, both for the grant, and I think this is a question that's emerging more broadly. Frankly, I don't think it's because faculty love assessment. Most faculty don't get really excited when it's time to meet to talk about assessment. We're in some ways forced to do it, and yet I think there's something about assessment that's deeply scriptural. It's biblical. It's about the formational journey. How do we even know we're growing? How can we pay attention to this over time? Is it possible to do that? And then for those of us creating programs and opportunities and classes, how do we know our students are gaining from it what we are putting in our student outcomes that we hope they'll gain? How can we understand that? So I think part of the way I've begun to think about this is to say that we are kind of in a second generation space of spiritual formation in our time. So the first generation, as you think about immigrants and how they function, my husband and I served in immigrant church for a time, and we watched how the first generation would come in and just try to learn the language, try to figure out what kind of jobs they could access and get given their background, where to live, where to buy food, what kind of food to buy, how to cook. So many of these kind of first generation questions that have to do with language and simply existing in a new climate and a new culture. The second generation, and I specifically did youth and young adult ministry, it's such a different place, isn't it? The second generation is saying, how can I go to school so I can get the job I want to have? Not just to pay the bills, but to feel a sense of purpose and meaning in my context. They were moving kind of beyond language to creating structures and systems in which to function. When I think about where we are in spiritual formation, I think some of that language work has been done for us. I think of myself as second generation in the world of spiritual formation in the evangelical church. Sometimes I'm still in the first generation. Every time I get a new Baptist student from rural Texas who said, what? Or what is spirituality, with real kind of skepticism. So sometimes I'm still doing first generation language work, but But I'm so grateful to those who have gone before and done some of that first generation work. I think assessment may be something that is more common in the second generation because some of that groundwork's been done for us. And now we're building out. We're exploring what is next. Where is the future of this? And so part of our work may be in that direction. As you already heard, I've been on some Association of Theological Schools opportunities to evaluate in other schools for accreditation purposes, and that's been, a delight, learning from how other schools are working on spiritual formation and then figuring out how to assess it. And so I thought it would be helpful to start by looking at the call to theological schools, just to actually see what's in the language. Ironically, we get prepared with PhDs and whatever, MDivs, whatever context, be it church, seminary. But then we don't ever get to learn about what we're actually supposed to be doing in terms of education. Those of us who are faculty get very little training and background in education in our doctoral work. But indeed, there is language in the ATS degree program standards that help us understand what formation is and what we ought to be looking for. So the program in, be it MDiv, MA, whatever, should provide opportunities through which students may grow in personal faith, emotional maturity, moral integrity, and public witness. So you can see many of the things that we've read about in various spiritual formation books, and I think things that we are theologically committed to. The development of capacities, intellectual and affective, individual, corporate, ecclesial, public. All of these certainly are values that we have that show up in the ATS literature. Also, there's a commitment here to programs that provide opportunities for commitment to Christian life and faith. And these are very practical elements that we really need to think about. How do they fit into the programs that we offer? Expressions of justice. How is justice part of spiritual formation? Leadership development, something we heard about in the last session for those of you who went to that one as well. Devotional life, evangelistic witness. I know this last one, often we have a bit of a hard time putting together formation and evangelism and exactly kind of determining how that would work in a program and how we would assess it. And these are to be consistent with the overall goal and purpose of the institution. I had the privilege of spending 3 months with Dan Alshire here recently after he completed his years as executive director of ATS. He spent some time in our seminary just helping us think through questions of theological education and assessment. One of the things that he says that I found extraordinarily helpful after his 30 years working with ATS, he says that theological education in the last couple of decades really focused on professionalism. This was at a time when denominationalism was really strong in North America. There was a sense in which if you became a pastor, priest, minister of some type, simply being pastor, priest was enough to be considered respected, to be worthy of being listened to, and so on. What he's saying is that in the last couple of decades and now moving forward, our culture does not value the institution, the diploma, the degree, the role in the way that it once did. And what he's saying is he's seeing a shift toward formation as the core of what is needed in the life of a minister. Less about professionalism, more about formation. And he's articulating this notion that seminaries should make formation the core of their student learning outcomes, the center of why they exist. Once upon a time, congregations had the idea that the seminary would form the minister, right? The seminary would do the work of creating this person with great character and maturity. They would know scripture, they would know the skills of ministry, but the formation of character would happen in the seminary as well. Well, ironically, the seminaries thought the congregations would form, would teach personal spiritual practices, and so on. And somehow, many seminary students landed up in a kind of spiritual desert, not attending to this in either place fully. Alshire's arguing that we move that back into the life of the seminary and see that as a deep need. I'm sure if you're at this conference, you're already on board, and I'm preaching to the choir. But I think that's a part of how, when we are assessing our curriculum, we need to ask those kind of core questions. And then he said, number 2, that spiritual formation is notoriously hard to assess. How can you possibly assess how people are growing in character and ethics, how they are maturing, how they look more and more as if they were living the life of Christ in their own shoes? How do we even do that? He argues that this is extremely difficult, and ATS has even chosen to be rather oblique in its description of assessment on this particular issue, because it recognizes how difficult it is, if you're not going to rely on self-assessment alone, to actually have other people assess students in their maturity and formation. And so he has mentioned that there are a number of schools, though, that are moving toward increasing, and this I think works better not in free church traditions, but in traditions that have more structures. He says Roman Catholics in particular have found ways to involve students with faculty advisors, with field education, mentors, and so on, so that there are regular, consistent checkups that deal not only with skills of ministry, but also with maturity and moral formation, prayer life, and so on. And he says what he's observed over time is those schools seem to have the best access and the most kind of data and the most awareness of what's actually going on with their students in their spiritual lives, because they're creating these intentional mentoring relationships between faculty, mentors, field education, and the student over the course of their seminary degree, which I found very helpful. So now a brief snapshot of what's been going on at Truett Seminary at Baylor University. I can't say we have all of this figured out. Again, more questions than answers, just to be honest with you. So briefly, we have a mission, like many others. Our school actually started in *94 with 51 students. So we're pretty young. We're a baby seminary in many ways, developing out of shifts and changes in the larger Baptist context. Some call it a takeover, others call it something else. No matter what you think about that, we began in '94 to educate men and women for worldwide leadership and service, and so on, in Christian commitment within a caring community. What's interesting about Truett is that spiritual formation was a founding pillar from the beginning. So somewhere along the line, this became a kind of first-generation commitment already, which I'm so grateful for, because it would be so much harder for me to have entered in 2010 when I started my work there, if that language had not already been part of the DNA of the seminary. So I have that as a gift that came before me. The goal from the very beginning was to emphasize the centrality of spiritual growth and maturity in a minister's life. And the founders believed in the necessity of personal and communal spiritual practices to nurture intimacy with God and develop this Christ-like character. So from the very beginning, a director of spiritual formation was put in place to address those concerns. So the locus of spiritual formation from the perspective of faculty and staff at Truett is that, first of all, it requires participation in a local congregation. Baptists will always be deeply congregational, and I think it is no different when we think about how we train from the seminary. Students have been encouraged to be involved in corporate activities central to historic Baptist spirituality, and we actually do teach about historic Baptist spirituality. Personal spiritual disciplines have been in play from the beginning. We've talked a lot about that with students long before my time, and there is a distinct commitment also to make sure that witness and service be understood as part of Christian spirituality and engagement in the church and in the world. Seminary education and practice given significant attention to spiritual formation Truett faculty recognized from the beginning that seminaries have a role in teaching about the nature and process of spiritual formation, attending to this, first of all, as a co-curricular component, which frankly was the beginning point. We did not have much in terms of an actual credit hour curricular emphasis on spiritual formation. I think all of the faculty found ways to incorporate formation into their various areas, but primarily it was considered to be co-curricular at the beginning, and the curricular dimension evolved over time. And so the primary beginning point was with what we call covenant groups. This is really a Wesleyan kind of way of thinking about spiritual formation, the idea that we start small groups, and these are places for the practice of spiritual disciplines, for teaching disciplines, and then also a place to hold accountable for a rule of life, a way of living, drawing also on Benedictine. So there's a little bit of eclecticism here, but essentially it was pretty deeply Wesleyan from the beginning. So all students have been required for many years now to participate in 6 semesters of weekly gatherings within a small group. The idea is for them to come in, be placed within a group, and then stay together for 6 semesters. That's the ideal scenario. They meet once a week with a mentor, in many cases an alum or somebody in the community. Occasionally it's also a more advanced student who's been studying spiritual formation. But placed together in order to work toward prayer, contemplative practices, reflection on skills in ministry, the connection between theology and practice, something that we do in those groups, focusing on character and spiritual resources for ministry leadership. We are not quite at the point that Wesley was, where he would make people coming into the group say, are you willing for me to tell you what ever is in my heart concerning you? We don't go that far. Maybe we should. I don't know. But we don't perhaps have the level of accountability that Wesley did. But we do have a certain amount of accountability that is built into the program as students create a rule of life and then report to one another once a month how it's going and how it needs to be shaped further. And then over time developing coursework in spiritual formation and discipleship. And these are courses that have been formed into a concentration which is available to students. So I won't spend too much time on understanding spiritual formation, since I know this is something you all are well versed in. But essentially, as a founding pillar, we have considered formation along the lines of the types of things Foster and Willard have taught for a long time. That spiritual formation is a process by which human spirit or will is given a definite form or character, having to do with becoming like the inner being of Christ himself, and that spiritual practices are integral to this formation, serving as patterns of communal and individual action that open people's lives to God's forming and transforming presence through word and spirit. I was happy to hear about word and spirit this morning because we're really committed to that combination as well. And so now to talk for a moment about curriculum and assessment. When students will be, know, and do is pretty essential in our view. Becoming deeply committed to the life of the church, formed as followers of Christ, committed to integrating Christian practice into daily life. We think in terms of personhood, community, and witness or mission. I think those are sort of 3 core areas that we give primary attention to. And we understand that as being deeply engaged in community. We actually don't think you can grow alone. We don't really believe in the idea that human beings are created to know God alone. This is a deeply communal process, and that's how we've shaped it over time. So now I want to make a couple of comments about assessment and how we've been working on that. Now I want to talk about assessment fairly broadly because of course there's a certain level of assessment and spiritual formation where we're paying attention to our own growth and we invite others into our lives to attend to our own growth. But then there's also the broader curricular assessment, right, where we are responsible, those of us involved with this kind of planning and teaching, in actually assessing what we see going on and whether we're assessing our assessment, in a way, of formation over time. So a couple of observations. Let's see, okay. And I want to share, as we've been evaluating our process, some of the quotes over the last few years we've heard from students to give you an idea of what they're saying as they're assessing the program. So some of the observations we've made is that knowledge and understanding of spiritual growth and development has been possible and very effective for the most part. So a couple quotes here from students. Before seminary, I believe spiritual formation was a minor part of the Christian life. Now I believe spiritual formation encompasses all and is the foundation for life with Christ. This is actually what we want. I can't say it better than this. And this is what we're going for. And then how I viewed spiritual formation has changed, says another student. Through interaction with the spiritual formation program, I now see the spiritual life as a long journey with slow and steady progress. Very pleased to see comments like this. This is consolation for me when I get to read this kind of thing. Significant development in the variety of spiritual practices used in everyday life. This is another key piece of what we're finding. That another student says, my practices hardly look the same. I practice silence and centering prayer. I've incorporated the prayer of examine in the Jesus prayer. Journaling continues, but it is less intercessory and more vulnerable. Before seminary, quiet time had become a necessary but sometimes mundane part of my spiritual life. Now I long for time with God. I practice Sabbath, and I really miss it when other things in life break into it. So we're seeing that a big piece of what we learn is the importance of practice and how it broadens their understanding of what practice can be. This is a very common finding. Third, a growing appreciation of small groups with formational leadership for personal spiritual growth and character development. My experiences in covenant group were transformational. I experienced healing of wounds. I was also shown my weaknesses, the accountability part here. But in being shown my weaknesses, I was nurtured to growth and change. That only works in a trusting community. Covenant group allowed me to grow in understanding and forgiving people who might not have treated me right. Really appreciated that comment as well, because understanding how to live in community has to be an essential part of formation. I loved our group leader. She was able to serve as a mentor figure for us. A couple more. Integration of spiritual formation with the theology and practice of ministry. I think we can't do it well without integration. We can't silo it as something separate from our commitment to theology and practice. Seminary has changed my view of discipleship and spiritual formation. It opened up new avenues to experience and grow in relationship with God that I had not previously known. So many churches present spiritual formation as a litany of to-dos. While I always recognize spiritual formation as relational, I can now incorporate that theological understanding into practice. The things taught in the spiritual formation department are what pastoring people is all about. Pastors need to be told the truth. The truth is that competent pastoring of people is rooted in things taught from this specific discipline. So again, this incorporation of formation, practice, theology, belief systems, all of that to be functioning together. Okay, a couple of desolations as well, because, if this is going to be anything like Ignatius, it has to have both. Mature, knowledgeable leadership is essential in spiritual formation groups. In any kind of formational process, the mature leader is essential. So here's one thing we heard about that in one particular group. In some ways, the leadership of our group was more harmful than helpful. There were strong tensions between this is what we're supposed to do and this is what our group wants to accomplish. I'm sure you can imagine a group evolving into this kind of situation. Another comment, I needed a little bit more of an introduction because I didn't fully understand the point or necessity of what we were doing. Yeah, so we took that to heart, and this was another kind of core finding. Finally, a diversity of spiritual traditions and practices is necessary. Quote, my entire group was high on the natural outdoorsy side of the program. We chafed under the forced contemplative nature of covenant group. So that's something we need to face. How much are we privileging a certain stream of spirituality? Is there another stream that needs more attention? I want to just briefly mention that there are assessment challenges, and this is something actually that Dave is going to work through further. But Dependence on self-analysis of the participant is a big challenge. How do we get beyond that? As I said earlier, sometimes having other people moving in to assess may be the only way we can come up with to really face that problem. It's something we're working on. We struggled to understand the impact of spiritual formation in diverse dimensions of the program. How is this working in other parts of the program? And so figuring out the integration of that. The nature of development and character formation in itself causes some to be uneasy about the ability to be honest and accurately assess spiritual formation, including one's personal relationship with God. And I think when we think about online and distance education, we have challenges too. How are we going to do this beyond when we can sit in the group facing each other? And we're experimenting now with groups that move online and are looking at each other over various we're working on something for the fall for that right now. All right, I would like us to take some time now to spend a few minutes in a group. So find 2 or 3 people and explore these 2 questions. And I know that some of you may not be in a school, and so if you want to talk about a congregational curriculum or some other form of context organization, feel free to do so. What elements of your school or church curriculum are intentionally designed to cultivate spiritual formation and character development? And then what co-curricular elements are intentionally designed to do the same thing? And we have essentially, as we've been assessing our program over time, moved toward more increased curriculum. We now have credit hours for the first time this year associated with spiritual formation, the spiritual formation program that is required for all students, not just electives. So we're moving to a model where every other week they'll be in class, every other week they'll be with a group, and we're going to be teaching and practicing over the period of these semesters. We've also moved toward having a spiritual direction training program, in our case, something I prayed about for 7 years, and finally has come to fruition this year, and we're doing it for the first time. So there are things we're doing now to respond to our assessment processes, and I invite you all to think together as well about curriculum and co-curriculum. So take about 5 minutes or so to talk to one another. Just before we get toward what Dave is going to share with us, one last couple of things about perhaps second-generation spiritual formation in congregations and seminaries. A couple thoughts I have about what we need to work on. Where are areas of growth? Working collaboratively across schools, churches, and organizations. I cannot say enough about how good it is not to feel so lonely in this world of being the spiritual formation person, but having friends who are working on the same questions of assessment. And I'm so grateful for Dave and others who invited me into their community to have these conversations. I think that's something we should work toward. Attending to assessment data prayerfully and discerning new possibilities. So we don't leave everything we know about the spiritual life aside when we do assessment. Let's actually do assessment as people with a passion for spiritual formation, with a passion for discernment, who have skills for prayerful reflection and listening to the Spirit. I think that's really key. So to be practical theologians in that regard. And then attending to theology as in practice of spiritual formation, one's own tradition while valuing the traditions of others. So we're not aiming for this kind of de-traditionalized approach that's eclectic. We actually want to be rooted in our tradition and value the traditions of others to make a kind of patchwork quilt, but that's rooted in something that God's people have been doing over time and have found effective over time. And then finally, we must continue research and writing in spiritual formation in congregations and seminaries, including empirical and contextual research. So studying what we're doing, gaining data and trying to understand and make sense of it. That's, I think, part of our call.